Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into a snowy Korean courtyard where the air is crisp, the ground is frozen, and rows of large earthenware barrels sit patiently under a blanket of white. They look still and quiet, almost like silent sentinels guarding secrets from centuries ago. Inside those barrels, though, there's life, slow, bubbling, invisible, a quiet orchestra of microbes playing the winter symphony of kimchi. You can almost imagine a faint crackle, a tiny whisper of fermentation as cabbage and spices slowly transform. It's a peaceful scene, and you are right in the middle of it. Snow crunches under your feet, and your breath hangs like smoke in the air. The village is hushed, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a wooden gate. People in thick, padded coats shuffle past, checking their buried jars with the care of watchful guardians. And you, well, you'd probably not last an hour here if you had to live without central heating. The cold is biting, but somehow also strangely comforting, like nature pressing pause on the chaos of daily life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The houses around you are traditional Hanok. Wooden beams, curved tiled roofs, the faint smell of smoke wafting from chimneys. Beneath those roofs, families are wrapped in thick blankets, sipping warm barley tea and waiting for the long fermentation of their kimchi to do its quiet magic. Winter in Korea was always a test of endurance, and food storage wasn't just about convenience, it was survival. The kimchi barrels are not decorative curiosities. They are winter's promise, lined up in neat rows as though even the food must endure discipline. Historians still argue whether the earliest kimchi was even spicy at all. The chili peppers we associate with its fiery taste only arrived from the Americas in the 16th century, long before Koreans had already been salting and fermenting vegetables for centuries. So the image you're standing in now, a red-stained cabbage soaked with garlic, ginger, and chili, wouldn't have existed in the courtyards of the early kingdoms. Instead, you'd probably be staring at paler jars filled with radish greens or plain cabbage leaves steeped in brine. Less dramatic, maybe, but no less important. The barrels themselves, called ongi, are fascinating if you run your hand along their rough clay surface. They're not airtight like plastic tubs in your fridge. Instead, they breathe. The clay is porous, like skin, letting air move gently in and out, which means fermentation happens in a kind of quiet dialogue with the winter air. And if you lean close enough, you can imagine a faint, sour, salty smell escaping, mingling with the scent of snow and wood smoke. You may wrinkle your nose, but to the villagers, that smell is reassurance. It means the food is alive. You watch an old man in a wide-brimmed hat shuffle out into the snow. He brushes frost from the lid of one barrel, lifts it slightly, peers in, then nods with satisfaction. Nothing dramatic, just a check. A gesture repeated by countless hands across centuries. And you realize this isn't just food storage. It's ritual, comfort, a way of keeping rhythm with the seasons. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some households used to bury their barrels completely in the ground, like treasure chests filled not with gold, but with sour cabbage. Digging them up later must have felt like unearthing edible time capsules. Modern refrigerators can't quite match that suspense. In the silence of this snowy courtyard, you notice how the barrels seem almost like family members. They're lined up respectfully, tended to carefully, covered with straw mats or wooden lids to shield them from frost. In a way, They are adopted into the household, sitting faithfully outside through the coldest nights. And yes, you might joke that no one ever knitted them sweaters, though one suspects if they had, a grandmother somewhere would have tried. The Korean winter, though severe, offered something precious: stability. The consistent cold slowed the fermentation, giving kimchi its crisp bite and deep flavor. Without refrigeration, this natural chill was the only way to keep vegetables edible for months. It's a simple equation: cold equals preservation. And yet, somehow, when you
Today's villages, the debate continues, but you're left with the image of farmers crouching in the cold, trusting soil and salt to do their work. The most important part was survival. Winter in Korea could stretch on brutally, with winds that cut through wooden homes and frosts that shriveled anything left above ground. Fresh greens? Forget it. Your body longed for crunch, for vitamins, for something beyond rice and dried fish. Salted cabbage filled that void, not glamorous, but reliable. Imagine the relief of biting into something crisp and sour in January when everything outside lay frozen and lifeless. Of course, once chili peppers arrived from the Americas in the 16th century, the story shifted. Suddenly, kimchi developed that fiery red punch we know today. But in these earliest days, your bowl would have looked pale, perhaps tinged with a faint green or cloudy brine, not glowing crimson. Still, the sensation on your tongue would have been a revelation: bright, sharp, alive. Picture this: a wooden table in a dimly lit room, a clay bowl set down before you, rice steaming, maybe a scrap of dried fish rehydrated in broth, and beside it, salted radish, crunchy, sour, just enough bite to keep your appetite alive. No feast, but in the harshness of the season, it feels like luxury. And here's a lighter joke to keep you warm. You probably wouldn't last as a taste tester in those early days. Imagine someone handing you a leaf of cabbage they've left soaking in salty water for weeks. No refrigeration, no sterilization, just trust in the invisible. You'd probably mutter, "This smells like something I should throw out." But somehow, against all odds, it wasn't poison. It was preservation. The word kimchi itself has a winding history, derived from older terms like chimche, meaning submerged vegetables. That's really what it was. Veggies, dunked, soaked, submerged, until they transformed. Even the language hints at the strangeness of the practice. Take something fresh, drown it in salt, then wait for it to come back alive. You can almost hear a farmer centuries ago saying, "Don't worry, it looks weird now, but in a few weeks it'll be delicious." And just when you think it's all about practicality, culture sneaks in. The earliest written records mention kimchi not only as sustenance, but also as something traded, gifted, shared. A bundle of salted greens could travel from neighbor to neighbor, cementing relationships. In a way, kimchi wasn't just a dish, it was social glue. Scholars sometimes ask whether these earliest versions tasted anything like the kimchi you can buy today in a modern supermarket. Chances are, no. They lacked the boldness of chili, the sweetness of pear, the fragrance of garlic. But what they did have was the unmistakable essence of transformation, that little miracle of fermentation. And that's what you're standing with tonight in this snowy courtyard, staring at barrels whose lineage stretches back to those first desperate experiments. If you crouch down by one of the ongji jars, brush snow from the rim, and press your ear against it, you might even imagine you hear whispers of those centuries-old voices: farmers who salted radishes in clay pits, families who trusted jars buried in the earth, ancestors who built this tradition one crunchy bite at a time.
Snowflakes drift lazily down as you wander closer to the rows of buried jars. And now the focus shifts to the rituals of storage, the careful choreography of winter preparations.
You notice that this isn't a casual habit, like tossing leftovers into a fridge. It's more like a seasonal ceremony, one that happens every year with a rhythm as steady as the turning of the calendar. Families gather together once the harvest is over, and cabbages lie piled in great heaps, pale green leaves fanned out like sleeping swans. The moment is called Jimjang, the time when households prepare their winter kimchi. It isn't just about chopping and salting, it's about ensuring survival until the thaw. The whole family participates, from children scrubbing radishes to grandparents sprinkling salt with practiced precision. Everyone knows their part, like an orchestra tuning before a concert. The barrels are waiting. Large ongji jars, sometimes taller than a child, sit outside, their open mouths ready to receive the salted cabbage. But here's where the cleverness comes in. To keep the temperature stable through the icy months, people bury the jars directly into the earth. Imagine kneeling down, digging into frozen soil, lowering the heavy vessel so that only its rounded lid peeks above the ground. Once covered with straw mats, the jar becomes insulated, protected not just from frost, but also from sudden warmth that might ruin the delicate fermentation balance. And you might smile at the thought. Whole yards transformed into patchworks of buried treasure, lids poking out like mushrooms in snow. You'd probably trip over one if you weren't careful. The sight of an entire village with dozens of jars tucked neatly under earth and straw must have been oddly beautiful. Historians still argue whether this burial practice was purely practical or whether it carried symbolic meaning as well. Was it simply about temperature control, or did people see it as a way of returning food to the soil, letting earth and clay cradle their sustenance until it was ready? Some folklorists suggest there's a quiet, ritualistic element to it, like planting seeds in reverse, harvesting vegetables, then returning them underground to be reborn as kimchi. Once the jars are in place, winter quiet takes over. The families check them only occasionally, brushing away snow, lifting a lid, tasting a leaf to make sure the brine is progressing. The rest of the time the barrels sit silently in the ground, fermenting in slow motion. Inside, gases bubble, lactic acid builds, flavors deepen. Outside, the courtyard looks frozen, but under the surface, it's a hive of activity. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, it was common to mark the jars with little charms or patterns scratched into the clay. These weren't just artistic flourishes. They were protective symbols, warding off bad spirits or bad luck that might spoil the food. You can imagine a grandmother leaning over, etching a simple cross or spiral into the lid, whispering a blessing under her breath. Maybe superstition, maybe science by accident, but either way, it gave comfort. And if you're imagining this process as quiet and solemn, remember that Jimjong was also incredibly social. Neighbors often gathered to help one another, the work stretching on for days. Laughter rang out as cabbages were hauled, knives chopped steadily, and giant tubs of salt water sloshed about. It was hard work, yes, but it carried the buzz of togetherness. Even children, probably bored out of their minds, joined in, sometimes sneaking cabbage leaves to nibble before they were properly salted. The ritual didn't stop when the jars were buried. Families often kept careful mental notes about which jar was buried first, which one had the right saltiness, and which should be eaten earliest. You might picture a row of jars as though they're lined up soldiers, each waiting its turn, each destined to be opened at the right moment. And here's the joke of the night. You, standing there in the courtyard, would probably mess it all up. Imagine you, hungry in the middle of January, pointing at a jar and saying, "Let's open this one." A grandmother would swat your hand away instantly. "Not that jar! It's too young! Patience!" Kimchi wasn't rushed, it was cultivated. And as you take a step back, snow crunching underfoot, you can see how the ritual of burying jars became more than just storage. It was part of the seasonal rhythm, the same way people chop firewood or mend roofs before winter storms. It gave people a sense of control in the face of long, harsh months. When everything else seemed uncertain, the weather, the harvest, the survival of livestock, the jars in the ground offered quiet reassurance. And even today, modern Koreans still feel the pull of this tradition. Refrigerators may have replaced soil pits, but the rhythm of jjimjang continues. Families still gather in late autumn to prepare vast amounts of kimchi, often enough to last months, sometimes with neighbors helping, sometimes with friends. It's a ritual that connects the modern kitchen to the ancient courtyard, linking stainless steel fridges to clay jars under snow. And as you wander back across the courtyard, watching your breath cloud in the cold air, you realize that the story of kimchi isn't just about flavor. It's about patience, planning, and trust. Trust in salt, trust in clay, trust in the earth itself. And as the wind whistles softly over the buried jars, you feel the same patience settle into you, a reminder that some of the best things in life can't be rushed.
You brush a bit of snow from your coat sleeve and move closer to one of the barrels, your fingers tingling from the cold. The vessel feels rough, almost sandy beneath your gloves, and that's because it isn't just any container. It's an eungji, the clay jar at the heart of this entire tradition. You lean down, studying the texture in the dim winter light, and realize these jars aren't built for beauty, they're built for function, though they carry a rustic elegance that's easy to miss at first glance. Eungji jars have been crafted in Korea for well over 2,000 years. Their design hasn't changed much in all that time. Wide bellies, narrow necks, simple lids that rest loosely on top. They're not painted or polished like porcelain. Instead, they're sturdy, unpretentious, built to endure frost and rain. But their real secret lies in the clay itself. Unlike glass or plastic, eungji clay is porous, full of microscopic holes that allow air to seep in and gases to seep out. It's a living vessel, breathing quietly as the fermentation inside it unfolds. Historians still argue whether the use of eungji spread from early Chinese clay traditions or whether Korea developed its own distinctive style independently. Either way, the Korean version became a household staple, not just for kimchi, but also for storing soy sauce, pastes, even grains. A courtyard without eungji was unthinkable. They were, in many ways, the refrigerators of their time, though far more graceful to look at than the humming metal boxes in your kitchen. As you imagine the jars lined up in neat rows, another quirky fact pops up. Artisans sometimes referred to eungji as breathing jars. The pores in the clay allowed the fermentation gases to escape naturally, which meant the vessels never exploded under pressure. Compare that to your modern soda bottle left in the sun. You'd have a fizzy mess in minutes. These jars solved that problem centuries before carbonation even existed. You picture a potter at work, kneeling beside a wheel, shaping a mound of wet clay with steady hands. The room smells of damp earth, the air warm from the kiln nearby. Each jar takes patience, the rolling, the firing, the glazing with ash that makes the surface water-resistant, but still breathable. Eungji making was an art, passed down from one generation to the next, often staying within the same family of craftsmen for centuries. Even today, a few villages in Korea still specialize in this craft, their courtyards stacked with rows of freshly made jars waiting to be fired. And here's a joke to warm you up. Imagine a medieval Korean teenager being told by their parents to take care of the jars. Not a horse, not a cow, not even a younger sibling, the jars. It sounds absurd until you realize how valuable they were. Break one, and you've lost months of food. Drop a lid, and the whole family's winter supply might spoil. Household chores really did mean life or death. Suddenly, washing dishes doesn't sound so bad, does it? You notice how the lids don't seal tightly. At first, you might think that's sloppy craftsmanship, but in reality, it's intentional. Fermentation needs to breathe, and a jar sealed too tightly would ruin the process. The loose lids also made it easy to open them quickly, check the brine, or sneak a taste without too much fuss. Families often placed heavy stones on top to keep pests out, while still allowing air exchange. Simple, clever, and effective. One of the most fascinating things is how the jars interact with the seasons. In the summer, the porous clay allows heat to dissipate, keeping contents cooler than the outside air. In winter, the earth around buried jars insulates them, keeping the inside temperature from dropping too low. You realize that these jars weren't just containers. They were active participants in the process, working with the climate, with the soil, with the seasons. Scholars have debated whether ungji technology was one of the reasons Korean fermentation traditions became so distinct compared to neighboring cultures. Without these jars, would kimchi have developed its signature taste, or would it have ended up more like a sour pickle, sharp but shallow in flavor? There's no clear answer, but standing here with frost on your eyelashes and the earthy jar under your hand, you suspect the vessel made all the difference. Imagine for a moment that you shrink down small enough to slip inside one of these barrels. It's dark, tangy, and bubbling with unseen activity. The walls of the jar are damp, faintly warm, and you can sense tiny exchanges of oxygen happening through the clay. It's almost like being in a womb, safe, sealed from the chaos outside, but always quietly alive. Strange as it sounds, the ongji isn't just holding food, it's collaborating with it. As you straighten up again, brushing snow from your knees, you glance across the row of jars, their lids glistening under the moonlight. They don't look dramatic, but in truth, each one is a marvel of ancient engineering. These jars turned vegetables into survival, salt water into sustenance, and clay into quiet magic. They may not hum like refrigerators, but if you listen closely enough, you might just hear them breathing. Your breath fogs the night air as you step past the line of jars and hear faint voices drifting from the edge of the village. It's not silence anymore, it's chatter, laughter, the rhythmic chop-chop-chop of knives against wooden boards. You've stumbled into gimjang, the great communal ritual of kimchi making, and it's as much a social gathering as it is a culinary necessity. Picture an entire courtyard transformed into a workshop. Mountains of Napa cabbages tower like green cliffs, their pale stalks glistening from being freshly washed in icy water. Radishes roll around in baskets, garlic bulbs lie in clusters, and red pepper flakes pile high in wide bowls, bright as embers against the snow. Everyone is bundled in thick coats and scarves, their cheeks pink from the cold, and yet the atmosphere is anything but grim. People are laughing, trading gossip, teasing children who dart between legs with stolen cabbage leaves. There's a rhythm to it. Someone salts the cabbages, someone else rinses, another person mixes the spicy paste of garlic, ginger, salted shrimp, and chili. Hands move quickly, almost automatically. You can see how muscle memory has been passed down through generations, grandmothers folding leaves with the same ease as their mothers once did. The courtyard hums with activity, like a hive of bees working together to fill the hive with honey. Historians still argue whether gimjang was primarily a survival strategy or whether it should be seen as a cultural festival. After all, it wasn't just about food storage. It was about community, bonding, and reinforcing ties between neighbors. Some scholars compare it to harvest festivals in Europe or barn raisings in early America. The work was too much for one family alone, so the whole village pitched in. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, households used to compete over whose kimchi was the best. Neighbors secretly tasted one another's jars, passing judgment in whispers. Imagine a group of villagers standing around in the snow like stern judges at a cooking competition, only instead of reality TV cameras, it's just candlelight and gossip. The variety was staggering.
Some families preferred sweeter blends, adding slices of pear. Others leaned toward brinier versions, heavy with salted fish. A few adventurous cooks threw in oysters or pine nuts. Children always had their favorites, sneaking tastes when adults weren't watching, grimacing if the spice overwhelmed their small tongues. The courtyard smelled sharp and pungent, garlic and chili stinging the air until your eyes watered, but in the most comforting way, like a blanket woven from flavor. You probably wouldn't survive long in this assembly line. Imagine someone handing you a cabbage half your size and expecting you to salt every layer perfectly. Miss one leaf, and your batch could spoil. Get distracted and drop it in the snow, and you'd earn the stern glare of an elder who has done this work 100 times before. And yet, as daunting as it sounds, there's a warmth in the process, a collective sigh that says, "Together, we'll get through the winter." The work often stretched over several days. Courtyards filled with steaming pots of broth for warmth. Children fetched water from frozen wells, and neighbors shared not just labor, but stories. A widow might leave with jars filled by her community, while a newlywed couple might get playful teasing about their first kimchi together. In this way, the food became more than preservation. It became memory, cemented in the laughter and effort of many hands. One of the sweetest quirks of gimjang was the tradition of sharing with those in need. Families often prepared more kimchi than they could eat, intentionally so, because giving jars to poorer households was considered a duty. The act of handing over a clay jar, still warm from being buried, carried the weight of generosity and solidarity. In a season when survival was uncertain, sharing fermented cabbage was as profound as sharing gold. If you linger in the scene long enough, the chatter turns into background music. You hear the crunch of salted cabbage, the scrape of ladles mixing pastes, the muffled thud of lids being lowered onto jars. Snowflakes swirl above, and lanterns cast golden halos on the crowd. The whole process feels timeless, as though you've stepped into a recurring dream that plays out every winter across centuries. As night deepens, the last cabbages are tucked into jars, lids are secured, straw mats laid carefully across. The workers stretch their backs, sip hot broth, laugh at the day's mishaps, and then, one by one, they trudge home through the snow, leaving behind rows of barrels glowing faintly in the moonlight. The courtyard empties, but the jars remain like sentinels in the snow. You wander closer, breath visible in the frosty air, and realize that these barrels are not just containers, they are vaults of survival. Their clay walls, thick and porous, hold secrets of chemistry that villagers trusted long before anyone wrote down words like lactic acid or probiotics. Inside, the cabbages rest beneath their spicy blanket, pressed firmly so no air pockets remain. The lids are weighted with stones or capped with tightly packed straw. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening, but the quiet hum of fermentation has begun. You picture the unseen armies of bacteria setting to work, chewing sugars into acids, transforming the leaves into something tangy, complex, and astonishingly safe to eat months later. Here's the mainstream fact. Fermentation as food preservation has been practiced worldwide for thousands of years. From beer in Mesopotamia to sauerkraut in Europe, people stumbled onto the idea that letting microbes do their thing could extend a harvest's life. But in Korea, with its sharp winters and vegetable-rich agriculture, kimchi became the undisputed champion of survival. And the quirky tidbit? Villagers sometimes swore they could hear the jars breathing. In the dead of night, when frost glazed the rooftops and the only sound was the wind, faint pops and burbles echoed from the jars as gases escaped. Some said it was the kimchi sighing contentedly. Others joked it was the spirits of ancestors enjoying a midnight snack. Historians still argue whether households truly understood the science at play or whether they chalked it up to folklore. Did they know they were cultivating beneficial microbes, or did they just notice that buried jars stayed edible while others spoiled? The debate lingers, though the results speak for themselves. People survived. You kneel and brush snow off the rounded shoulders of one jar. Imagine lifting the heavy lid and feeling the sharp tang rush out, even after weeks of silence. The aroma alone would tell you if the fermentation had gone well. Sour but balanced, spicy but inviting. A bad batch smelled immediately, and families knew to discard it. That sensory vigilance, nose, tongue, eyes, was their laboratory. You wouldn't last long as a tester. One whiff too strong, and you'd recoil, coughing into the night. Yet villagers leaned in, unbothered, trusting their senses sharpened by generations of repetition. They didn't need thermometers or pH strips. They had grandmothers. And grandmothers were far scarier than spoiled cabbage. The jars also carried superstition. People whispered that disturbing them too soon angered the kimchi spirit. Children were warned not to play near the jars, not just because they might break them, but because it might jinx the entire winter's food supply. A cracked jar was disaster. Not just lost cabbage, but wasted salt, spice, labor, and hope. As you picture these vessels lined up under layers of snow, you realize they were a kind of insurance policy. Villages could face crop failure, blizzards, political turmoil, but if the jars held, the people endured. Their bellies stayed full, and with full bellies, spirits stayed stronger. There's a humbling sense of patience here. Modern life runs on instant gratification. Tap a phone, a meal arrives. But these jars taught endurance. You salted today so you could feast months later. You worked in the cold courtyard so your children could have warm soup when the snow piled high. And perhaps the most beautiful part, no jar was identical. Each carried the subtle signature of its maker, the pinch of extra chili, the particular soil the cabbage grew in, even the microbes from that household's hands. Food scientists today confirm that every fermentation reflects its microclimate. In other words, kimchi wasn't just survival food. It was an edible fingerprint of a family, a village, a moment in time. Snow crunches under your feet as you step back, leaving the jars to their quiet alchemy. They need no supervision, no prayer, no coaxing. They simply need time. And in that time, while winds rattle shutters and ice slicks the wells, an entire village will survive on the trust they placed in these humble clay barrels, breathing, burbling, waiting in the cold.
Snow has a way of muting the world, softening every edge, every sound. But not everything is uniform under the frozen sky. You step closer to another cluster of jars, and a villager waves you over, lifting the lid of one barrel like a magician unveiling a trick. What wafts out is familiar but not identical to the last jar you peeked into. This one is brighter, sharper, less mellow. The secret? Seasonality. Mainstream fact, not all kimchi is created equal, and not all kimchi is even intended for the same moment in the year. Koreans have long understood that ingredients shift with the seasons, and kimchi reflects that. Winter kimchi, the kind resting beneath snow, tends to be heartier, spicier, and designed for longevity. Spring kimchi, in contrast, is lighter, often made with young greens or herbs meant for immediate eating rather than months of storage. You lean closer, and your nose picks up subtle notes of sweetness in another jar where fresh radishes were layered in. And there, a softer, milder aroma, almost floral, from a batch made with mustard greens. Families could tell the season by the taste alone. A sharp crunch of Napa cabbage with a fiery red paste meant the dead of winter. A quick pickle of watery cucumbers whispered that spring had arrived. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some households believed that kimchi made during certain lunar phases tasted better and kept longer. They swore that the gravitational pull of the moon
influenced the fermentation, like an invisible seasoning sprinkled from the night sky. Was it science? Probably not. But you imagined a grandmother wagging her finger and insisting, "Never make kimchi on the wrong moon, or you'll end up with sour water instead of supper." Historians still argue whether seasonal variation was driven more by necessity, using what was available, or by deliberate culinary choice. Did ancient cooks design these shifts, or were they simply improvising with whatever vegetables survived the frost? Either way, the outcome was an edible calendar, a way of marking time by flavor. As you picture it, you realize that eating kimchi wasn't just eating food, it was tasting the rhythm of the year. Winter kimchi gave you the punch to survive the cold. Spring kimchi woke up your senses after months of heavy meals. Summer kimchi cooled you down with refreshing crunches. Autumn kimchi leaned toward the robust, preparing your body for the icy days ahead. You imagine sitting at a family table, rice steaming in bowls, a single dish of kimchi at the center. It looks simple, but the flavor tells you exactly where you are in the cycle of life. One bite is not just cabbage and chili, it's the echo of soil, season, and time. And then there's your own role in this village fantasy. If someone offered you a slice of icy winter kimchi, you'd probably nibble, flinch at the chili, and gulp water like a tourist. The villagers would chuckle, gently, not unkindly, and pass you a smaller piece. They know it's strong. It's supposed to be. That heat in your mouth mirrors the fire you'll need to get through January. The snow crunches again underfoot, and you realize that every jar here is a silent storyteller. Some will mellow for months, waiting for February or March. Others will be opened within weeks, their flavors less sharp, but full of the fleeting character of a season. Each jar, each taste, is a way of saying life is never static. Even in the dead of winter, change is brewing, bubbling away in clay vessels, ready to surprise you when you least expect it.
You leave the snowy courtyard behind and find yourself wandering into the grand gates of a palace. The walls are high, the eaves curve like frozen waves, and beneath their shadows, another set of kimchi jars waits, though these look more polished, arranged in neat rows, watched by attendants in silk robes instead of woolen wraps. Royal kitchens, unlike village yards, were laboratories of excess. Here, kimchi was not just survival food, it was ceremony, prestige, and artistry. If ordinary households packed Napa cabbage with chili, garlic, and salt, the palace cooks layered in pine nuts, chestnuts, slices of pear, and sometimes even thin slivers of abalone. You can almost picture the king leaning back, eyebrows raised, as a servant spooned out this jeweled, luxurious version of what his subjects ate in humbler bowls. Mainstream fact, in the Joseon dynasty, records show dozens of different kimchi recipes cataloged in palace cookbooks. Some were white kimchi, no chili at all, delicate and mild for the royal stomach. Others were broth-based, poured over with chilled brine, so that even fermented vegetables carried a hint of refinement. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest palace doctors prescribed kimchi as medicine. Imagine being told by a stern court physician, "Your Majesty, 2 more servings of fermented cabbage and your constitution will improve." You probably wouldn't argue. If the king sneezed, the entire bureaucracy trembled. Keeping him healthy was everyone's business. Historians still argue whether the palace truly influenced everyday kimchi recipes or if it was the other way around. Did royalty invent gourmet kimchi that trickled down into common life, or did palace chefs simply elevate rustic recipes to please noble palates? The debate lingers, like steam rising from a rice pot. In these royal kitchens, kimchi was more than food.
It was performance. Servants in colorful hanbok moved in choreographed patterns, chopping, salting, rinsing, seasoning, all under the watchful eye of head cooks who barked out instructions like military captains. Each barrel destined for the royal table had to be flawless. No cracks in the jar, no oversalted brine, no blemish on a cabbage leaf. You could almost picture sneaking a taste in that kitchen, your fingers trembling as you lift a morsel. Would it be more delicious than the villagers' version? Maybe. Or maybe you'd discover that even with all its chestnuts and abalone, it still carried the same fermented punch, the same hum of lactic acid, the same warmth of survival food. Royalty couldn't escape biology. The microbes worked the same in palaces as in peasant courtyards. And here's the sleepy joke for you. If you ever got caught sampling royal kimchi, you'd probably end up demoted to scrubbing rice pots. But at least you'd go down with good breath. Garlic breath, but good breath nonetheless. The jars, too, were buried outside in the earth, though their placement was carefully planned by court geomancers who believed the location of the jars affected their success. Too close to the walls, and the energy would be stifled. Too far into the gardens, and the protective aura of the palace might fade. You can't help but grin. Imagine drawing a royal salary just to decide where to put the pickles. Still, it mattered. These jars weren't just food, they were symbols. To host a foreign envoy and present a spread of delicately flavored kimchi was to say, "This kingdom thrives even in winter. We feast on abundance when others starve." Kimchi became both a culinary tradition and a diplomatic statement, whispered through the crunch of cabbage and the sparkle of chili. The jars wait quietly in the palace yard, just as they do in villages, but their flavors travel further, onto banquets, treaties, and royal celebrations. And as you step back into the snowy night, you realize that kimchi, whether eaten by a farmer huddled near a fire or a king reclining in silk, told the same story: resilience, patience, and the alchemy of survival.
The palace walls fade, and soon you're back on the rougher roads of the countryside, where jars don't stay still for long. Kimchi wasn't only about sitting in snow-covered courtyards. Sometimes it had to travel. Picture a merchant bumping along a frozen path with a cart rattling behind him. Among his wares, cloth, rice, maybe a jug of rice wine, there's also a heavy clay jar tied down with rope. Kimchi on the move. Mainstream fact, by the late medieval period, kimchi was portable food. Soldiers carried it during campaigns, and merchants brought it to markets far from home. Its salty, fermented nature made it safer than fresh vegetables, less prone to rot during long journeys. The military, in particular, prized it. Nothing like a fiery bite of fermented cabbage to liven up bland field rations. The quirky tidbit? Archaeologists and historians say some sailors in Korean fleets even carried smaller kimchi jars aboard ships. Imagine that. You're in the middle of the ocean, waves slapping at the hull, and instead of hardtack biscuits, you crack open a jar of kimchi for dinner. The smell probably traveled across the deck faster than the wind. Some sailors grumbled, others cheered. Either way, it kept their guts healthy on voyages that lasted weeks. Historians still argue whether this practice truly spread kimchi beyond Korea in the early centuries, or whether it remained mostly a local delicacy until the 20th century. Some suggest merchants introduced versions of it to neighboring regions, planting early seeds of curiosity. Others argue it stayed tightly Korean until migration carried it abroad much later. The truth is foggy, like breath in the winter air.
But picture this: a jar bouncing along on a soldier's pack or tucked under a merchant's cart. Maybe it leaks a little, staining the wood with chilly brine. Maybe someone in a border village gets a taste for the first time, coughing at the spice, blinking at the sharp sourness, and wondering what on earth they've just eaten. Food can cross borders faster than armies, and often more memorably. For families sending a son to war, a jar of kimchi was more than food. It was a lifeline to home. Mothers packed it with quiet prayers, sealing not just cabbage, but memory and comfort. A soldier sitting by a campfire, biting into a piece of cabbage from home, would taste more than spice. He'd taste his village, his courtyard, his mother's hand pressing leaves into brine. And you, if you were a conscript in some forgotten campaign, would probably fumble with the lid, let the brine splash your lap, and immediately smell like garlic for weeks. But hey, at least you'd be well fed. Diaspora communities later carried kimchi even further, across oceans, into immigrant kitchens in places like Japan, China, and eventually the United States. But long before airplanes and shipping containers, it was already traveling on foot, on horseback, and in creaky wooden boats.
Snowflakes swirl again as you follow the traveling jars back into the quiet rhythm of storytelling. You've seen the village, the palace, the road, even the sea, but now the mind turns inward, to scholars in dimly lit rooms scratching their heads over what exactly kimchi was centuries ago. Mainstream fact: the earliest records of kimchi don't mention chili peppers at all. Those fiery red flakes that paint modern kimchi only arrived after the Columbian Exchange, when peppers traveled from the Americas in the 16th century. Before that, kimchi was salted vegetables, radishes, cabbage, cucumbers, fermented with brine, sometimes flavored with garlic, ginger, or even pine nuts. A much paler dish, less aggressive on the tongue, but still alive with sourness. The quirky tidbit: there are ancient texts describing pickled water vegetables served at banquets, but historians can't always tell if those dishes were proto-kimchi or entirely different creations. One 12th century poem praises the refreshing bite of preserved cabbage alongside rice wine, but the wording is vague enough that scholars still argue whether it truly meant kimchi. You'd think someone back then could have just written, "Yes, this is definitely kimchi," but no, poets loved ambiguity. And here's the ongoing debate. Historians still argue whether kimchi before chili peppers should even be called kimchi at all. Some insist the essence of the dish lies in fermentation, regardless of spice. Others say, without the red pepper heat, it's just salted vegetables with an identity crisis. Imagine academics in conference halls politely bickering over cabbage semantics. It happens. For you, wandering through this snowy dreamscape, the jars in front of you shift in your imagination. Some are pale, brimming with lightly salted leaves. Others glow red, flecked with fiery chili. Both belong to the same tradition, yet both spark debates that ripple through history books. It's oddly soothing, isn't it? The idea that even something as simple as a jar of cabbage can puzzle generations of scholars. Food isn't just sustenance. It's memory, language, argument, and comfort, all brined together. And now, as the story slows, the wind softens.
The jars, whether red or white, sit patiently in their snowy beds. Their contents bubble quietly, neither caring what names scholars assign, nor what debates swirl in lecture halls. They exist simply to feed, to warm, to endure. You step back, letting the scene fade around you. The courtyard rests in stillness, the jars standing like silent companions in the frost. The villagers had gone inside, shutters drawn, fires glowing. The barrels breathe softly in the dark, their contents shifting, transforming, waiting.